Tara is assistant professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Iowa. She received her PhD in English from Johns Hopkins and a BA in political science from Barnard College. Tara's work has been published in every place you can imagine that publishes on early American literature and culture, early American literature, commonplace, legacy, J19, criticism, American periodicals, everywhere you can think of. Her work has also received some support from all of the organizations and institutions that support this period of scholarship. So she's received funding from John Carter Brown, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, Library Company of Philadelphia, McNeil Center, and on and on and on. So we are so happy and honored to have her here tonight. And I will say that Tara and I were at a conference a couple of months ago, and this is like in my opinion, like this would be the highest praise for me. We both went to a panel where one of the young women who was speaking, she's still a graduate student, was like, I can't believe Tara Bynum is here. Her work has shaped the whole way I do my like work now. And I was just like, oh my God, Tara's work and like interpretive frameworks are shaping whole scholars projects, which is just absolutely wonderful. So, and it's amazing what Tara had a fellowship at AAS about 10 years ago, was it? 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago,
like maybe 7, but we're getting close to that decade. Just crazy.
And it's amazing to see this book like come to fruition. Just so like it's amazing. So if you haven't read it yet, please go out and pick it up. We are putting a code in to go buy the book, and you get a discount. So go get it. It's also available on Kindle, which I was like, that's how I got it first. Anyway, we're here to talk about the book, not about all the praises that Tara has received in the past. And I guess, I mean, I can just give a brief intro to what the book does, and then we can get into some questions that I have for you. The book looks at 4 Black writers in early America, Phillis Wheatley, James Gronniosaw, John Marrant, and David Walker. And very different writers, very different people, and you make sense of their work through this larger interpretive framework you have about pleasure in reading and pleasure in life, really. So I want to ask about that interpretive framework and how you came to it and what it means. So you say a lot about Black interiority and the white gaze. And one of the quotations that stands out is one that you have from Toni Morrison, where she's, like the Black communities that you talk about and the reading communities and literary communities that you talk about are places where, and as Toni Morrison says, white people cannot find us. So can you talk about like how you came up with this interpretation of Black literary communities, reading communities, writing communities, publishing communities in early America, with this sense of Black interiority and the white gaze?
Well, first, let me say thanks so much for having me.
I didn't even give you a chance to talk. I'm like, let me just go on and on.
Well, I think that I am super excited to have this conversation with you, Ashley, and I'm grateful to the Bibliographical Society of America for kind of extending the invitation and kind of bringing me into conversation with you this evening. So I really like this question, and I will acknowledge that kind of my kind of one lamentation is that Toni Morrison has had every thought that I have ever thought. Like 30 years before I could think it. So, I guess shout out to Toni Morrison for paving the way in that regard. But, I think that the first iteration of my thinking about this book kind of started as a question that I have asked in a number of different ways, which was, what was Phillis Wheatley thinking about when she was brushing her teeth? And I remember first asking this question, and it was a group of historians who all sat back and were like, were toothbrushes around in the 18th century? Like, I have no idea if they were or not. That's not the point. The point is like in what might be understood as a quiet moment, an intimate moment with the self, like what what was Phillis Wheatley thinking about? And, I think that question then had me find my way to the Morrison quote that you referenced and cite. I think that it struck me that there have to be these moments of like these moments where the so-called white gaze is not top of mind, is not present. And how do we get at that? And how do we access that? And I think what became interesting, all the more interesting and curious to me, was that I think that those moments kind of existed in this early writing, that I didn't have to dig too deep for them, but instead just had to be willing to acknowledge that those who were enslaved or living in something that might be called freedom, but, might otherwise be problematic, that they could have an interiority unto themselves or within a community, and they could relate to each other kind of as such. So, Toni Morrison said it better, but that's kind of the origin story of that line of inquiry for me.
I mean, it's just so interesting because you do reference people like Marissa Fuentes and Sadia Hartman, who have always like encouraged us to read between the archival lines or like read underneath something. And you just flip that around and say, we don't need to read through anything. Like, we just need to read what's there. We just need to read. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say that I think that both kind of reading practices have to exist. I think that what feels important is like ensuring that there's room made for what is in fact there and what's present. Because I think oftentimes, especially when I talk to students, like there's an impulse to want to pursue what isn't present, to kind of want to pursue the story that might be interesting to us. Everyone wants to know how Uber Tanner and Phillis Wheatley met. I have no idea. Why? In part because why would they need to rehash in letters how they meet? Like, you don't do that.
I would love to read that letter, though.
I mean, of course, everybody would love to read that letter present day, but they don't need to write that letter. They don't need to say, remember that time we met over and over and over again. There are things that exist between them and they know that. But even though the answer to that question isn't present, doesn't mean that those letters aren't a treasure trove of information for us. And I guess I want us to kind of read against the grain as needed, while also remembering there's still a lot of information kind of present that we haven't necessarily dug so deeply into. And sometimes I think the digging doesn't happen because it's not the story that interests us, but it might have been the story that interested them.
That's a very good point. And I also love that you're giving respect, like even within the space of Black interiority in the archives, like you're still giving respect to those moments that we don't have access to and we never will have access to. Like I love that you're not, it's because so many people now are using elements of historical fiction, which is great. But I love that you don't, even try to imagine. You give space for those moments and those private moments to exist, which I think is really beautiful.
I think I think that the idea of kind of acknowledging the desire for privacy, and also like the need for it. At some point, I guess I started thinking about like, what is my business to know? And I think it's tricky because I think all of it is my business. I'm in the business of looking at, deceased people's things. I want to know all of the things, no doubt about it. And also, I guess I'm struck by the possibility and maybe even sometimes the certainty that I can't know all of the things. So, I don't necessarily have a real approach other than to kind of keep looking, but in that process, I become more curious about what it means to not find things and maybe to be okay with the not finding and to kind of wrestle with the desire to find while also not finding. I think that sure, we can speculate and also like what would happen if we sit with the fact that we may never know how Uber Tanner and Phillis Wheatley
we probably won't
meet.
I wish.
I
Oh,
mean, of
don't
course.
get me
I
started.
mean,
Don't
I
get me
wish I could find Obertenner's letters, but
well, maybe you
alas,
might. Maybe you will. Tara,
maybe.
I also want to talk about reading practices because you referenced some sort of archival reading practices. But in the book, you also talk about like reading feelings and a kind of
Mm,
illiteracy. And you also talk about Black Lives Matter as a reading practice. So can you
mhm.
kind of talk a little bit more about that? Just again, I mean, there's so much packed into just what you do in the first like 20 pages of this book. And when that one student at the conference was like, yeah, you shaped my whole way of doing things, I was like, yeah, this first portion of the book really does do that for, I think, the field. So I would love to just hear you speak a little bit more about like Black Lives Matter as a reading practice and just the general, like, what does a written text matter in the grand scheme of things?
So I think that I'll start with the end. I think that the written text does matter. And I think it matters in, a kind of very disciplinary way. I feel like I'm an English professor. We need
You have
books.
to say, yeah.
So
Reading
it's
18th
always
century books.
helpful to have, some sort of physical object to look at. Um, and I think what stood out for me as this book was developing, and it's a book with many origin stories. And I think the one of those origin stories is my dissertation. And I think that, I initially sort of made made the mistake of like being surprised at the amount of writing that Black people
Mhm.
were that Black people were doing in the 18th century. And so I think that, both reading and publishing were things that uh really caught my attention. And, I think since my dissertation, which was so long ago at this point, I think I became all the more interested in the idea of reading as a practice of interpretation, also like as really like an important sort of way into the stories and the poems and the letters and the pamphlets of these particular writers. I mean, I think they kind of talk about their own reading,
Mhm.
and I, of course, am reading them as they talk about their own reading. So I guess reading for me did a lot of work in part because it suggests analysis and interpretation as well as physical object, um, or book or something kind of to that effect.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that, I like the idea of like reading pleasure,
Mhm.
or reading pleasures, and like not necessarily knowing like whose pleasure was being read, or is it the pleasure of reading. I
Mhm.
think playing around with it in that way, I think did a lot of work, speaking to my experience of those texts, while also kind of getting at the that at the writer's experience of reading and
Yeah, because
engaging with
you
text
had talked
themselves.
about that moment before where you were like discovering all the Black writers from the
Oh my
18th
God.
century and like you just, yeah, your face, you're like overjoyed. You still remember like the moment of like, oh my God, I can't believe it. There's
Well,
like,
I think it was such a funny moment. I had the good fortune of kind of being at Hopkins, who subscribed to the Evans digital database. And I mean, this is also a long time ago. So there were many places that did not. And I just remember seeing the subject heading Blacks as authors and expecting to find Phillis Wheatley, if
yeah.
that. And it was pages and pages and pages.
And you're like,
Like, oh
oh,
my goodness,
there's my project.
I've completely
Yeah.
misunderstood so much.
And
And
I mean, just to, like as an aside, like why do you think that, and because Evans has been around for so long and we just didn't see the kind of attention like when you started your dissertation, why do you think it was just ignored. That subject heading was ignored for so many years by so many people.
You know, I
Because it
don't,
did, right? It's like passed over in favor of, because so many people were going to Evans to get political, like what is the political life of the 18th revolution? And
right,
Blacks as
right.
authors, where, but
There's I wish I could remember now, like how many pages it was at that time. I don't know if I don't know if it's set up in the same way, but it felt like it was 15
I'm
pages,
sure it
10
was. Yeah,
pages.
I'm sure it was. And
Um,
like text after text after text.
yeah,
Mhm.
and different kinds of text. So you had
Yeah.
execution sermons, um you had Phillis Wheatley, you had narratives, you had sermons.
Yeah.
There was so much, but I think that like I guess I mean I can also think of your question as one that's like, why isn't the 18th century like
Exactly.
thought of when, when one thinks of African American literature? And I almost think that a lot of it has to do with the kind of content that isn't politicized in a very familiar kind of way,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is not to say that it is kind of lacking in interest with its surroundings. I think it absolutely engages with its historical moment, but it's I think it's literature that's not always explicitly about freedom or enslavement or like dismantling white supremacy. So then like where does it fit?
Yeah.
And I think Wheatley ends up being kind of a interesting sort of beginning to African American literature, because I think On Being Brought from Africa to America, as the poem that I think is always anthologized. I think that what might be read as sarcasm or ambivalence or like
Mhm.
kind of hyper religious faith, I think that there's that tension there that kind of makes her worth engaging with or exciting. But I think that, reading some of these other narratives, and like I said, execution sermons and traditional sermons, I think it's harder to
Makes
see
sense.
the resistance.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so speaking of Phillis Wheatley, I have a few questions about imagining. Now that we said I don't want we want to respect the private lives, but you talk a lot in the book about Wheatley, signing her own name in her letters and selling her own
Mm.
books and making money and writing to people who are helping her sell her books. And I want to know, your question is like, well, what was Phillis Wheatley thinking when she brushed her teeth? But I want to know what you think she spent her money on that she was making from selling her books.
What do I think she spent her
Yeah.
money on? Her shillings and her pence and her pounds. Oh my goodness. That I've never thought about that, Ashley. Oh my gosh. Um, I there's a part I have no idea. I think that's the but
Maybe more
like
pens and paper to write more letters.
right,
Yeah.
or I guess I, she's very much about getting her money.
Yeah.
And I think that who isn't about getting their money, like just to be clear. So I also wonder how much her urgency around kind of getting her money and her coins has to do with in a very practical sort of way, like needing to take care of herself
Yeah.
and like and therefore using the money for sort of super practical things out the gate, like making sure that she has food and shelter. And then, from there, I do wonder if she opts to get, some something more fanciful than
Mhm.
that. Like
Fun.
does Phyllis Wheatley like to dress nice? It's funny, the the kind of Black community that she knows well in Newport um, is often it seems to me, very well dressed. They always have like silk, or like Caesar Linden is always like getting some new silver knee buckles and whatnot. So,
I do also, if you haven't yet read Tara's article on Caesar Linden's lists and account books in early American literature, 2018, I think.
Yeah, that's the one.
Definitely read it. It's short and it's quite smart. And I think you're going to be pursuing that work a little bit in the future, which hopefully we can get into in a little bit.
Yeah.
But I also, in regards to Phillis Wheatley, you do talk about her dashes, and we always hear about like Emily Dickinson's dashes. We don't hear as much about Phillis Wheatley's dashes. And I want to know what those dashes do in her manuscripts and her letters and her poems, like what you think her dashes do. But also, if you were to think more broadly about like Black manuscript culture in the 18th century, and you had to come up with some kind of like, if you are the theorist of Black manuscript culture of the 18th century, you've done work with account books, you've done work with letters, you've done work with, manuscript poems. What can you say about Black manuscript culture? Black art, Black archival culture, Black manuscript culture. Let's leave it at that.
Black manuscript
Starting with the
culture, the
death,
handwriting is
starting with the death.
gorgeous.
Yeah.
The handwriting is gorgeous.
And you
It's
say
so
like
pretty.
he took like so much pleasure in just signing her name.
Yeah, and I think about like everybody, shouts out John Hancock and that big old signature of his. And it has its place. And also I think about like Phillis Wheatley as well, and the kind of adornments that go below the signature. And I need to shout out Alexis Pauline Gumbs for helping me first sort of think about that. And I think what's interesting about like thinking about the whole page itself of something like Wheatley's letters, I think that like I guess I was struck by like sometimes the size of the page, thinking about the way that the page has been folded so very intentionally, the wax seal, and like adding that to the idea of the dashes and the kind of very intentional sorts of pauses, and where the paragraph gets broken down, and realizing that kind of with a quill and ink, I think that there's even more intentionality than like me using my ballpoint pen here that kind of writes continuously.
Yeah.
At some point she has to the writing process is slowed down in such a way that I think it makes the dashes, the signature, the flourish under the signature that much more intentional. And then add that layer of like how the letter is folded, the wax seal, and then that it's given to someone who ensures that the letter gets to where it's going. Like it's such an interesting process. And like
Love to read you write a short piece for EAL, similar to what you did for Caesar Linden on Phillis Wheatley writing one of her letters to Tanner. Like, I would love to hear you go through that whole process in light of what you've written already in Reading Pleasures, and then connect that with, how the connection between Wheatley and Tanner kind of happens through that physical artifact. But
yeah, huh.
it's,
I think there's something
yeah.
to
I mean, when
that.
you
And I
hand
think it's
those letters, I mean, what are you thinking? Like, I just think about the way they feel, the way that they smell, the way that the ink looks. I mean, I think about the Phillis Wheatley poems that we have at AAS, and they're behind a Mylar sheet. And so people don't ever get to handle
yeah.
the actual physical artifact. I've never touched the manuscripts. So when you handle those letters, they're at Mass Historical, right? Most of them are at Mass Historical. Like, what is
Yeah.
uh, like, how do you sort of experience as the researcher the pleasure of handling those manuscripts?
Well, I think that the actual like 3D object like lends itself to, I guess, almost what I like just walk through, which is like I think what's striking to me is that they are still in such good shape
Mhm.
that it's all the more obvious how much care was put into writing them
Mhm.
and also how much care was put into keeping them.
Yeah. And can we
And
talk a little bit about that too, Tara? Because that, I think, you are so smart in the framing of this book. You really are. Um,
thank
and
you.
I know that you're working more on some of the archives and manuscripts that are in Rhode Island now relating to the Black community in Newport. And I would love to hear more about that. I would love to talk about the other chapters. I know we're getting like to the halfway point already. So if you all
Goodness.
have questions, put them in the Q&A. How is this happening? Um, but I really would love to hear you talk about your kind of understanding of how those letters sort of made, because I'm not going to try to summarize what you say because you say it much more smartly than I would. Um, Thinking about how those letters sort of make their way into the archives through Over Tanner, and like what you can, now that you've done so much work with Black archives in Rhode Island, what you can say about like the way that material created by Black people in the 18th century makes its way into institutions.
So I feel like there's a lot there, Ashley.
Sorry.
um, but I think that um so if we had to think about like Wheatley's letters to Tanner, I think seeing the kind of, you know, seeing them in real life in all of their three dimensions, like I said, it kind of helped me realize or helped me slow down enough to think about what it meant to sit down and write a letter.
Mhm.
And slow down enough to think about like the process, not only of writing the letter, but also ensuring that the letter gets to Uber Tanner. And there are about 8 or so of those letters. I think Mass Historical has 6, a private owner has 1, and Haverford has another. Um, and at at some point, kind of reading the proceedings of the Massachusetts Historical Society, I um, like learned about the provenance of the letters and how it's Uber Tanner who gets them to Catherine Eads Beecher, who then gets them to Edward Hale, who then gets them to Charles Dean, which is why 6 of the letters are at Massachusetts Historical Society. I think it's a footnote that I'd read many times, but it took me a second to think like, wait,
Yeah.
Uber Tanner kept the letters for, I think it's 50, 60
Oh, it was
years.
that long. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so like the letters are from 1772 to 1779. That's what's left extant. Uber Tanner gives the letters to Catherine Eads Beecher in 1833-ish. So we do
Yeah.
some quick math.
Yeah.
I
Over
think
50
it's,
years. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
And Catherine Eads Beecher is Uber Tanner's pastor's wife. Her husband, William Henry Beecher, Harriet's brother. William Henry Beecher is the pastor of First Congregational Church, where Uber Tanner has been a congregant for a long time. She was baptized in 1768 there. And so I think that the kind of the passing along of these letters is very, very intentional. One thing that I've wondered and have no answer to is like how many more letters there were.
Yeah.
I think for a long time I assumed that what is left is all there was, and then I thought about it and I was like, why would that be true? Why would these be the only letters? And they reference,
Other
Wheatley
letters.
references kind of other letters, or like I wrote a letter and it got lost, or
Mhm.
so it seems like there are more, but Tanner gives this particular set, and there's also a part of me that's like, these are churchy letters for sure, like they are talking about God and kind of Christianity and quite a
Yeah.
bit. So, are the non-churchy letters ones that Virginia said? Nah,
Well, not
these I'm not
they.
going to give to the church. Because it also is funny to think that, by the time she gives these letters to Catherine Beecher, she must be in her 80s. Uh,
Wow.
so, when she's writing to Wheatley is a 20 something,
Yeah.
I can imagine that their concerns um, are
Yeah.
wide ranging and diverse in the way of kind of that particular age group. So, yeah, it I'm kind of obsessed at this point with thinking about kind of the fact that Tanner keeps these letters kind of in a very sort of an anachronistic way without the help of plastic. And
Yeah.
then, Catherine Beecher
We don't need the
keeps,
plastic on our manuscript.
right? Um, and Catherine Beecher keeps them for another 30 years
Wow.
as well before they end up kind of in an institutional home
Wow.
or in a special collection. Um, so, I'm still figuring out like how to think through that kind of care, but I think that there's care there, and I think the care kind of has its origins in their actual friendship, the friendship between Wheatley and Tanner, the friendship, the friendship
Yeah.
that keeps them in communication with one another when they're, refugees because of the Revolutionary War. They stay in touch. I think too about the fact that Wheatley ends up in Providence. The folks go a number of places. But why is it that Wheatley chooses Providence? Is it, in some ways because she is kind of closer to that Newport base that ultimately gets displaced because Newport ends up kind of under siege, just like Boston. Um, and Providence is a place that a lot of the Newport Black community goes to.
Um,
So, you know,
yeah. And it's just, I think what you're doing now is what you're kind of saying is very representative of what I most love about the book. And it's that you put real people back into the past. And that's what I think, we're at a Bibliographical Society of America talk, and I think that's what bibliographers are also seeking to do, is to put real people back into the making of books. And you do this with archive, like I wish I had made a clearer note of this in my copy of the book, but you say something like um Black interiority, like the archive is actually a type of interiority. And I think it's, again, it's such a smart way to think about everything that you've looked at throughout the book, because you're saying like this is a type of interiority in and of itself. Like we don't, and I wonder too how you might connect what's happening with Phillis Wheatley's letters into, moving into an institution. And this is maybe a little bit too far afield, but like with the white gaze, like have you thought more about
mm,
how Black archives and like the interiority that is the archive connects with the white gaze of the, predominantly white institutions that like had Wheatley's letters for has had Phillis Wheatley's letters and poems for so many years.
yeah. Yeah, Massachusetts Historical gets them in 1863.
Yeah.
Um, I think to return to a question that you asked about Black Lives Matter as a primer. No, I think one of the things that kind of struck me when Black Lives Matter kind of became a hashtag first and later, branched out into a movement, I think what struck me about it was kind of the obviousness of the the obviousness of the idea. And I think that, I guess what I mean by it as a primer is that if we assume that Black Lives Matter, then I think it can kind of help us engage with the materials that are at these kind of housed in these archival and special collection spaces that are often associated with, historically, with a certain
Mhm.
kind of whiteness. So, I think I I guess I have thought in some respects less about the institutions themselves, and instead about the eyes that we bring to
Mhm.
what's there at the institutions.
Yeah.
And I think that there's certainly a way that I could think more about kind of the power that the institutions hold, and the power that's kind of connected to the history, as well as the present of those institutions. But I think what I have thought about more is just thinking, like, if we go in to these spaces with the idea that Black lives matter and have always mattered, I think, what then would we find? What new questions might we find ourselves asking? How might we interact with kind of librarians, archivists, and curators differently,
Yeah.
with that in mind?
So it's not a matter of like what has happened, it's a matter of what can happen.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Which is
Yeah,
awesome. Yeah.
yeah. While
It's
also,
such a
kind of
fun, I mean,
acknowledging
your
that,
book is like so you are you can be so sarcastic and so funny sometimes, and your book is just so positive. Like it
yeah.
really is. It's wonderful. So I love it. Um, so I think, yeah, I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet. So I'm gonna go into one more question and then see if
Okay.
we have any any that come in. But I wanted to ask about some of the other chapters because we've ignored, Marrant, and Gronniosaw and Walker. And I think maybe there's just so much there. I mean, there's two brilliant comparisons you make in a couple of the chapters with Marin about the talking book. There's some really smart writing about David Walker's typography and like the emotions and pleasure and anger that is present in
Mhm.
Walker's own published works. So again, we don't have much time, but I would really love to hear you talk about David Walker a little bit more if we can skip over the middle two chapters for now and and just hear you kind of expand upon your chapter discussing how Walker's typography seemed to be so emotional and like that the typography itself encouraged his readers to have such an emotional connection with the text.
Um, David Walker's appeal, he's my 19th century interloper, is, I think, a fascinating document and so fun to read. And kind of shout out to Marcy Denius for kind of first helping me to think about his type, and of course Jim Green at the library company for saying once to me, like, that Walker probably enjoyed setting the type and adding the exclamation marks. And I was like, oh, that actually seems like it could be fun. And fun in kind of the context of the sort of righteous anger that David Walker is so known for. And David Walker wasn't one that I kind of originally thought about, but instead he ends up there because kind of Jordan Stein kind of asked me to think about David Walker. And I reread the Walker and realized, like, oh, it's not just about anger. Like, he's actually like putting forth a sort of like redemptive idea, and like, if his kind of community, if his brethren, as he calls them, the colored citizens of the world, can get angry enough and kind of change the entire fabric and social landscape of the United States, then what follows is
Yeah.
joyful. What follows is happiness. So like, it's kind of in that sort of context that Walker actually is doing something that can fit in this idea of pleasure. And oftentimes Walker is not read in that way. Walker is read for his many exclamation points, the manicules that point out, the wrong that America has done to the Black community. And also, I think what Walker is pointing out is that he has envisioned a whole new kind of United States, one that is not a slaveholding society, one that does understand his brethren to be free and make space for that. And I think that that's a joyful kind of place, and one that he knows God will make a way for. So yeah, I think that there's a lot to Walker that is angry, and also a lot that's, I think, looking towards that joy too. And because he self-publishes his 3 editions, I think that there really is like the joy of the publication process. And I think there's always joy in righteous anger, knowing that you are on the right side of the argument.
Yeah, knowing that you're on the right side of the, moving toward the future. And just, sorry, one more question. I know we have some questions in the Q&A and in the chat, but if there was one thing, Tara, because I know probably there are some people here who haven't read the book yet. If there's one thing that you would want people to sort of take away from the book about Black life and Black literature, when they do go read the book, what would it be? I mean, I know yeah, go ahead.
I think that what I would want people to take away, and what I was aiming to do, was really to make these historical figures 3-dimensional. I wanted to make them feel familiar in some way. And I wanted that familiarity to be kind of historical. Because I think this is what I have kind of learned by way of students, is that, 3-dimensional Black people seem to get later and later in time. I think the idea that Black people could have interiority, or experience both enslavement and joy at one and the same time, or could live with the paradoxes that so define the human conditioning, the emotional paradoxes, the social paradoxes, the things that don't always make sense together, but people figure out how to do exactly that. I think that's available to Black people because they are in fact human. And so I think that that's like my key takeaway, is that it's not our particular generation, or
you don't have to
the
get
new
to like
generation
1890.
or you don't have to wait till the 21st century to happen upon Black joy because it was made into a hashtag. Like it's
yeah, it's there.
Joy and Black people have gone together for a long time, and documented it as well.
Exactly. It's paying attention to what is there. We have a couple of questions here. One from Erin, and she asks, she says she's fascinated to hear that you worked with a letter in a private collection. Do you have any thoughts about the existence of Black materials in the antiquarian book trade and auction market? And what does it mean? Uh-oh, I just lost it. Hold on one second. And what does it mean? Here we go. I'm losing the question for a bit. And what does it mean? Oh, hold on. Sorry. Just give me 1 second to scroll way down. All right, here we go. What does it mean for Black archives to survive? And I think this is a question much more about like the sale of Black manuscripts and books. And I don't know how much you've looked at the kind of antiquarian book market, or, kind of purchased old copies of things. And also, do you have any thoughts about the ways that Black collectors today are collecting some of this material, and the survival of some of the, 18th century material in collections of, of Black collectors, Black
Yeah.
institutions?
My knowledge is low. Um, there's so much that I don't know. I mean, I think that the story of the February 14th, 1776 letter from Phillis Wheatley to Uber Tanner that is now in private hands is an interesting one because it was sold at auction by Swan Galleries in 2005, and it wasn't supposed to sell for nearly as much as it did sell for. And I remember kind of reading about it, and what I did in 2005, thank goodness, was I took screenshots of the letter as it was posted. And as a result, I have since had the letter, but I don't know enough about kind of like the actual like world and business of Black collecting. I think that what is interesting, and a friend of mine, Barry Brown, and I, um, who's at the Schomburg, have talked a lot about like Black collecting by way of her work at the Schomburg. And
Right.
um, I think that it sometimes is almost forgotten that Black people have been collecting and intentionally collecting and also like ensuring that they have a legacy that is to be remembered.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of focus on kind of white institutions.
Yeah.
Um, and there's sort of like neglect at times that
Yeah.
it's not just the case that um kind of Black artifacts broadly
Yeah.
imagined are it's not just the case that they are
Well,
at kind of white institutions. There are all kinds of Black institutions that
well,
have been saving.
it's funny you bring up the Schomburg, and in relation to Erin's question, the Met had a great exhibition on Schomburg. I don't know, Laura Wazowitz from AAS and I saw it last year, and they made a lot of Schomburg, like saying everyone was telling him there was no Black literature before 1900, and he was like, "Well, it's my mission to go find it," and then yeah, he did. So
I
it's
like
like,
that. Yeah, he
yeah,
did. Done.
yeah, he found it. He found it going way
He
back.
won.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
did. Um, So Tara, a couple of other questions we have. I'm going to combine a couple of them from one of our audience members, James Bennett. And he's asking first if you've read Colson Whitehead and his sort of commitment to historical fiction. Do you appreciate the way that he approaches the past? And it's such a weird type of historical fiction too. So it'll be interesting to hear your perspective on it. And also he asks if you have any other suggested reading fiction or nonfiction.
Well, I'll start at the end. I think you should read Reading Pleasures. Everyday Black
No.
Living in Early America. I mean, I think that Colson Whitehead's work is kind of compelling
Mhm.
for a variety of reasons. I think I most recently read Underground Railroad, and I think that contemporary fiction has its place, but as someone who kind of deals in early African American literature, I almost am a much bigger advocate for uh, the past and what folks were writing then, because I think that it is important to remember that that African American literature is not just new, it's not just contemporary, but has a long history. So, as the 18th century African American literary specialist, I'm gonna kind of say Colson Whitehead is good, but let's think about kind of the Blacks as authors subject heading and get into those sermons and poems and letters and narratives of the 18th century, because they also should be read and engaged with.
And any other works? I know there are a ton of works mentioned in your book. Would you suggest any of those for our audience today to go read to explore more on like kind of theorizing Black texts?
You know, I think that, and I'm not entirely sure if this is what you mean, Ashley. I'm still going to stick with primary sources.
Okay.
And in the way of primary sources, I'm going to say Uber Tanner and Phillis Wheatley's
Oh, I like that response.
letters.
No one ever suggests primary sources.
Yeah, no, I'm here to advocate for the
I
primary
love it.
sources.
And
And
have all those letters have been digitized? Can we find them online, or are
yeah, the
they
Massachusetts
are?
Historical Society has
Okay, good.
digitized them. Their collection, Haverford has their letter digitized as
Great.
well. And I think that there's a transcription, certainly in Vincent Coretta's new Oxford, Phillis Wheatley's collected writings, and I think it might still be online, the February 14th, 1776, a transcription of it.
Great.
Yeah, no, I definitely had
I
to
love
make an
that. That
argument
is
for
a
that.
very different kind of suggested reading. So I love it. And one last question, Tara. We're kind of reaching the end of the hour. Um, oh, actually, I have a couple more questions, but let's do this one and see where it goes.
Here it goes.
Yeah. Alvin Patrick asks, I wonder if Dr. Bynum believes that the simple acts of being able to read about the world and to express their feelings is in fact the pleasure they derived. And it didn't matter what they read or what they wrote. If so, was it the freedom to do so? Was the freedom to do so the thing that gave them joy?
So I think that the I guess the pleasure that I was most concerned with is, you know, almost a pleasure that should feel somewhat familiar to us.
Mhm.
So, you know, I think the pleasure that Wheatley speaks of about getting a letter from her friend, you know, I think that's what struck me. And also I talk a little bit about her poems, and there's there are kind of characters in her poems that also kind of like feel excitement, feel pleasure. There's this conversation between love and reason and thoughts on the works of Providence where they are kind of reuniting, and it seems to feel really good. Um, I think about kind of Gronniosaw and Marrant as these two who are writing Christian conversion narratives. And I think that there's a great deal of pleasure that they derive from their faith. So while it might be true that present day that not everyone has um, you know, a faith that they subscribe to, I think that there's something maybe familiar in like the idea of believing in something so deeply and so richly, and having that belief kind of inform not only who you are, but like give you joy. And then David Walker, you know, is, as I said before, like it's about righteous anger and knowing that because you are right, there's going to be something that good that comes out of it. So I guess, you know, I would say that what I wanted to get at was, in fact, like the most mundane version of
Yeah.
this pleasure. And, you know, I didn't want to have their pleasure be derived from some sort of resistance to the kind of world at large, or a pleasure that had to kind of buck back at someone else's assumptions about who they are, what they could do because they were Black. So yeah, I think that what I'm kind of trying to get at is kind of almost like where we began with Phillis Wheatley brushing her teeth,
Yeah.
or you know, like when the when Black people are not thinking about the the white gaze, like where,
Yeah.
yeah, where, what are they doing in those moments, and what is the joy that kind of comes out
Yeah.
during those times.
I feel like you've taken like this weight off of Phillis Wheatley in such a wonderful way. Like you just said, she was human. Like she
Yeah,
created real manuscripts. She created real texts. She was a real person. Like
yeah,
we don't need to put every single thing on her. Let's just,
especially as the first.
yeah.
You know, I think that there's this moment in the February 14th, 1776 letter where she tells Ubertana that she has um kind of spent time with uh John Quamina. They also see Mr. Zingo. And what's interesting to me about it is that John Quamna is married, and it's the evening, and it's February 13th. So I'm being a little bit messy here, but for the sake of my point, like I I asked the question, like, what was Phillis Wheatley doing with someone else's husband? And it's 1776, so thinking present day, it's months before the Declaration of Independence. Like, she's a refugee. Ubertanner is like living where bombs are going off every day, but she still takes a moment to be like, I was hanging out with John Quamina, and we saw Mr. Zingo. Um, and maybe it's nothing, but I think even the possibility that it could be something is, I think just my way of like making her more than the poet of the frontispiece,
Yeah.
making her more than the first Black person to publish a book of poems, or a book of anything. So, I think that my aim is to like remember that she is a 20 something woman,
Or a
with a
teenager.
diverse range,
Yeah.
yeah, a diverse range of interests. And sometimes she's walking down the street, or spending time with
Yeah.
someone's husband, and she doesn't bother to mention their wives at all, and they both have them. John Quamna is got a wife named Duchess. Zingo, I think, is with a woman named Phyllis. It's not Phillis Wheatley.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Tara. It is 7:30, and I do hope all of you go out and pick up this book. It is just so smart, and I do think, it really is already starting to change the way we think about the 18th century and about some of these texts. And I think it will continue to do so. So thank you, Tara.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Thank you to the Bibliographical Society of America, Aaron behind the scenes. I appreciate it so much. This was a fantastic conversation.
And we will post this on our webpage, so please go find it and tell everyone to go watch the recording. All right, thanks, Tara.